Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Good afternoon. If I haven't introduced myself before, my name is Esma Malumi. I'm currently an A-level student, and the reason I am here is because I briefly worked with a friend of Deborah's on a campaign for digital access, because during the COVID pandemic, something that was really that recurring that really came up a recurring issue that came up was the digital divide in our education. So as someone who had to rely on digital services to study during lockdown, it made me see the gaps in our educational system and how the divide between like privileged students and less advantaged students only widened during the pandemic. So I was part of a digital a campaign to raise money for laptops and computers for students in Camden. So that was my borough, because I think 3,000 students were left without access to digital services. So it was something that was really important to me. So now I am here because I just think it's so important that in everything we do, we keep young people in mind, because they are not only our future generation, they are present, they are the here and now. So I think the reason why I joined this Great Imagining Project is because I wanted to see what we could do when we really embrace the curiosity and the imagination that young people live with. So I would just like to ask you guys to introduce yourselves, who you are, what you do, and specifically what you'd like to see in the future for your area of expertise. So if we start with Vivienne, welcome. Oh, you're on mute, Vivienne, you're on mute. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Vivienne Havel. I'm retired, but throughout my whole life, despite working in offices and things, I've been a craftsperson, making and doing with my hands. And my perspective is that I'm a lot older than all of you, I think, and I was brought up in the 50s when there were many equivalent situations to those now. Not enough housing, not enough money, not enough resources, and so we all had to learn how to make, do and mend and get pleasure from it. And I think that's a way forward from where we are now. We can learn lessons from then.
Thank you, Vivienne. Silas?
Hello. So originally I'm an engineer by background, which primarily means I like solving problems. And I've spent most of my life finding problems in society or to do with bits of society and trying to solve them. So I spent a lot of time working in the arts. I spent some time working with a ethical fashion company, trying to solve some fairly large problems with the world there. I'm now still involved with both of those things and a whole bunch of other things. And I'm just starting a startup in peripherally to do with AI and active mobility, ways in which we can use technology to help people in society.
That's really interesting. So I think that's really interesting. Thank you. Caroline?
Yes, hello, I'm Caroline Russell. I started out life as an artist. I then retrained in my early 30s as a civil engineer. And then I completed that, but I never practiced as an engineer because I had found I had 3 children, and I got involved as a community activist, and in particular a transport campaigner, campaigning to reduce air pollution and to reduce the number of road deaths and injuries. And through that, I got into green politics, and I was elected as the only non-Labour Green Party councillor in Islington in 2014. I'm still that person. But also in 2016, I was elected as a London Assembly member. And that means I'm one of 25 elected politicians in London whose job it is to check that the Mayor of London is doing a good job. So the Mayor of London has absolute power in terms of what happens in London, particularly around housing and transport. And the 25 London Assembly members just have to, we are the scrutiny body. We're the ones who keep an eye and check he's doing really well. So that's who I am. And I think in terms of vision, dream for the future. It's just that we really we've got this incredible disruption from the pandemic. Asma, you touched on things like the digital divide. That's just one of many inequalities that have been thrown into stark relief by the pandemic. And we also are facing a climate emergency. And I think we have to rise to this challenge. And my hope is that as a community, we manage to rise to those twin challenges of inequality and the climate emergency as we come forward through these next months and years.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much. Dominic, hi, welcome. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute. Yeah, that's better.
Hi, I'm Dominic Cullinan. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm an architect, a director of a company called Scabal, and we do loads of different kinds of projects, loads of scales of projects in London, the UK, and places like India. Yeah? And a lot of what we do is in schools, and a lot of what we do is imagining how schools could be. Sometimes we're very lucky to be able to make new classrooms or actually a whole school, in the case of UCL Academy, by starting very much from scratch about working out how schools could be more run by the pupils themselves, and then building an architecture around that. I'm also working on a project, and it's often with Deborah, that is about how to make housing much more accessible to a much wider group of what we call Imagineers, by developing developing communities, that can share a common aim, but within the world of a dream. So we'll build the dream together using what we call the choicosphere, and in that choicosphere, where hundreds of people will come together to make choices about what they would like in their own individual homes, we'll build communities that become so practiced, and expert, within that dream, that the dream itself will become a reality. And I'll stop there, but I had a kind of longer introduction, where I was going to try and more precisely describe that idea. Being an architect, I think, like Silas said, as an engineer, we're expected to be very practical. Obviously, the things we build must be buildable and possible, but also we describe ourselves as fantasists in the best possible way, that the fantasy is a way of prescribing or thinking about or making the future come true by first identifying it collectively.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Thank you very much. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Asma. So I'm also an architect, and I was part of the core team that designed the Eden project. So I'm going to be talking about how biomimicry, that is design inspired by nature, has a lot of the solutions that we're going to need to shape a really positive future for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And last but not least, Robin, good afternoon. Hello.
Hi guys, thanks for having me. My name's Robin. I'm a writer, comedian and campaigner. I've worked a lot with the House of Fairy Tales before, in galleries. We met first at the Tate doing a show there, and then in schools doing improvised storytelling with children. The thing I'd kind of communicate about that, it really resonated with what you said, Asma, about trusting children and about trusting their creativity and allowing them the space to be able to input in the intelligent, interesting, exciting way that they do. The other things that I've been campaigning on recently are inclusivity and disability rights, and on decolonization, particularly with a historical perspective in schools. And if I had a dream for the future, it would be creating a powerful green movement that is inclusive and viscerally relevant and energizing to people across the political spectrum, and has as a broad net. So that would be my ambition. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robin. We almost forgot Deborah. How could I forget Deborah?
Hi, I'm Deborah Curtis, and I'm so excited today because I've somehow been able to throw my great imagining into the world, and lots of people have been catching it and owning it, and it's starting to do its kind of seed planting thing that I've been dreaming and hoping it would do. I am actually on this panel. I haven't been on any of the other panels. I've been kind of like just kind of popping in and into the audience because I think this is probably closest to my area of specialism at the moment, because I am in a paradigm shift as an activist in the light of the climate and ecological emergency, and the work I've been doing for 20 years in imagination, creativity, and critical thinking in children has now got to somehow be part of that. So the mission with the Great Imagining is to put to kind of somehow create schools as the center of transformation in their communities. I'm really interested in the human ecosystem, which is sort of loose name for this chat, because like the mushrooms and the kind of the way that the world, the natural world kind of communicates as sort of like big macro organisms. I think that the community building of humans, if they're intergenerational and cross-disciplinary, can actually be an extraordinary intelligence. And I'm really excited about the brain of young, the minds of the young. And you know, as is proved by you, Asma, it's like kind of, you know, that we're fully formed when we're born. We just haven't got experience, and what all the intergenerational conversations can do is to speed up the experience possibilities for the young, and we're not doing that effectively in schools at the moment, and we need to be.
Yes, thank you, Deborah. We just have a new panelist. Hi, Storm. Thank you for joining us. Would you like to just introduce yourselves, telling us who you are and why you're here, and what we'd like to see in the future for your area of expertise? The sky's the limit with imagination today. So thank you. Sorry, Storm, I don't think we can hear you right now, or maybe check your microphone's working.
Is that better? So yeah, I've been here a while watching, so I managed to hear all the other panelists. I started life in Ireland, and in my childhood I lived across the world in different countries, including parts of Africa and Europe, and ended up in South London, where I still am. And in that time, I remember from a young age, and I've been told as well by others, I was always interested in plants, in our environment, in how other people interacted. I was often watching others. So I was interested in psychology from an early age, and in farming and politics. I was in a mock election, I think at the age of 6 or 7. So I started that early, and I've stayed on a similar track throughout my life. And it's taken me some time to weave these different threads together and realize how interconnected they are. And I'm currently ended up setting up a trust with some other colleagues, initially interested in sustainability policy, public policy, and weaving together the many layers of decision making: food, housing, agriculture, transport, architecture, and the things that we often think of in silos, but also thinking about how humans work, how we think, and how decision making reflects society and a community as a whole or doesn't, and also how we can develop and improve our decision making for the benefit of our own resilience and sustainability as a species and for our environment more generally. We've focused on one area in particular recently, which is housing, So I've been involved in many housing cooperatives, and we set up a network of community housing cooperatives. One which takes the idea of a housing cooperative, which is, for those who don't know, which is a cooperative is an organisation where everyone has an equal say to some degree, and everyone is involved in decision making. So with housing cooperatives, ultimately the aim is that all the tenants of the co-op are also the owners of the co-op, so effectively owning your landlord and giving you a lot of investment in the decisions that are made about your own home, who you want to live with, how you live together, how you use resources. And this seems quite remote from, in some senses, broader environmental issues and sustainability, but actually is quite crucial, because where we live, the jobs we choose to do, and the amount of resources we consume are very innately and intimately tied with our housing. So that's a lot of what I'll talk about today, but also more broadly decision-making and how on a broader scale.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you. And I think that ties in with what we will be discussing in one of our first points of discussion. I think I want us to start thinking about how we organize ourselves democratically, and how we can encourage young people to criticize and challenge existing systems of government, whilst also being creative as to what they would like the future of politics to be like, especially in recent years where politics has become more divisive than it has as unifying. And I think that is so important to really, really talk about the relevance of politics to young people in this world, even though they can't vote. And I think the fact that a lot of young people, like me including, can't vote yet, I think that is a reason for this feeling of disenfranchisement. So what I'd like us to focus on today is how, for this specific topic at the moment, is how we can encourage young people to get excited about politics when they can't actually get their hands stuck directly in direct democracy. So Caroline, would you like to begin and give me your views as to why young people should be interested in politics, and what a positive future for politics, what healthy democracy could look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm elected as a councillor under first past the post, and I'm elected to the London Assembly by proportional representation. So I have direct experience of the difference between those two systems. And most democratic countries use a system of proportional representation because it's fairer and you get a bigger diversity of voices coming into politics. So on the London Assembly, we have 12 Labour Assembly members, 8 Conservative, 1 Liberal Democrat, 2 Greens, and 2 from what was UKIP, and they now call themselves the Brexit Alliance Group because they left UKIP because it was too racist for them. Now, so on the Assembly, you have the possibility of influencing the 2 big parties, Labour and Conservatives, who basically dominate Westminster politics. So I've been able to expose that the Mayor was only using 0.01% renewable energy for Transport for London, which is one of the biggest energy procurers in the country. And they could have been investing in shovel-ready renewable energy projects to actually get new renewable energy on stream in order to supply TfL with renewable energy sources. So only by having Greens in the room do you actually get that diversity of thinking and opinions that actually can push the politicians who maybe have the power from the other parties to actually think in a broader and wider way. Now, in terms of actual engagement, I believe passionately that young people as young as 16 should have the vote. We have seen with the school strike movement and with the amazing work of XR, the power of young people, but also from people with XR, people of all ages and generations and backgrounds. I mean, we've seen kind of older people as well as very young people just rising up and making their views heard that the climate emergency needs to be taken seriously and acted on. And
before we carry on, how can we encourage young people to get excited about other aspects of politics as much as they have been with Extinction Rebellion in recent months? How can we ensure that that engagement and that sense of activism is sustained and is not just relevant for the climate emergency?
Well, I think you raised a really good point, Asma, when in your introduction, when you talked about the digital divide and the pandemic, and that is actually a divide that affects education. It affects young people's access to education if they don't have access to Wi-Fi in their home, if they don't have access to a device in order to be able to engage, and even access to headphones, because Islington Council provided several thousand laptops for young people who didn't have access to a laptop, but they forgot to provide headphones. And if that young person is living in overcrowded accommodation and is locked down, then you may have children of several different ages trying to engage with online learning, and without headphones to go with those laptops, actually they're not properly being helped. And if it's a household where they need to be given a device, they probably don't have the money to be able to go out and buy the headphones as well. So there's issues like the digital divide, but we've also seen throughout the pandemic the real brutal impact of growing inequality in our city, in our country. We've seen that, for instance, in London, it was the bus drivers who were disproportionately impacted by coronavirus, and it was Black and minority ethnic bus drivers in particular who were who died in disproportionate numbers. And I think the other thing that we saw with the pandemic was an incredible movement, grassroots mutual aid, which had people of all ages and a lot of young people involved in it. And my hope is that young people who have been involved in helping their neighbours, whether it's collecting food or prescriptions from the local shops, or whether it's running other errands for people who were shielding, it's that kind of experience of mutual aid will hopefully have shown people what a difference they can make with that grassroots organising, whether it's via WhatsApp groups or Telegram groups, that really made a difference to how our communities got through the first lockdown of the pandemic. I agree. I hope that something can come out of that.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. I would just like to take it on to either Robin or Storm, thinking about what Caroline, you were saying about, the grassroots organizations, how young people coronavirus has given young people some sort of reasons for getting involved in their communities. But I wonder how we can equip young people, especially in the school context, how can we equip young people to be engaged democratically beyond voting? Is this where social media comes to play a role, or are there other things that we haven't yet considered? So either Robin or Storm, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I can jump in. Is that okay, Storm? Okay, thanks. How can we equip young people to, well, I think there's a few things I'd just say quickly in response to that. Making sure that they know that politics is relevant to them, that politics isn't something that's happening in something that looks like Hogwarts down the other end of the road by people that don't look or sound like them, that it's relevant issues that matter to their lives. And I think a huge part of that, and almost the most important thing I would say, is demystifying the class system. And what I mean by that is, so I went to Oxford, and then there's obviously a very obvious passage for people who are in mainstream Westminster politics. It's through Oxford or Cambridge or a big university, and then off to Westminster. And they all look very similar, and they all speak in very similar accents. And I think it's demystifying that, saying that the rituals of those institutions are deliberately opaque. The reason that you don't understand them is there's been a history where they've designed to be exclusionary. To unpack and to provide a space for children where they realize that they have the skills and the wit and the intelligence to engage with that. And so I think that's a huge part of it, trying to demystify what Westminster is, what mainstream politics is. And even though the fact that it is dominated by people who may not look or sound like you, you've got something to contribute to it. And to kind of try and have the kind of the Wizard of Oz moment where you're like, these trappings of class are a mirage. They are there to try and intimidate you, but you have the energy and the power to get past that. And I think it's just really that, trying to empower children to understand that, or kids, young people, whilst providing a space for them to develop the skills you need once you get there, I think is the way to do it. Yeah.
I completely agree. So do you think that a positive political future would be more diverse in Westminster as the political institution, or would a good political future mean going away from that Westminster bubble and looking at more like grassroots and bottom-up approaches to political involvement? So do you think that in the future local government should be more sort of influential than national government, or is that something that is too radical for us to think about right now?
I mean, I'd say historically, you know, all rights won by people are wrestled from the control of the powerful, and that's done through popular movements, and that's usually outside of Westminster and putting pressure on those who are making decisions. And the answer has to be both. Like, we have to diversify our politics, and I wish we had more devolved power, but as we've seen with the struggles that have happened over COVID between devolved government and central government, there are certain powers that you can wield as devolved institutions and councils, but when it comes down to it, a kind of punitive, aggressive Westminster does still hold too much executive power. And the way to change that is through a combination of powerful movements outside of Westminster, but also trying to get representational change in there. And I absolutely agree with Caroline that the ultimate objective has to be a fairer democratic system and proportional representation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your contribution. I wonder if Storm, do you have anything to add for that?
I certainly do. I think in terms of decision making and empowering and involving people, firstly, firstly I would say politics and decision making are seen as two quite separate things in many ways, or at least politics is seen as a silo of its own, and the way we talk about it is if political games, voting, etc. If we dissect what politics is there for, or why we have elected representatives or even appointed representatives, they are there to make decisions on our behalf. And not just on our behalf, but on behalf of people around the world now and in the future. So grassroots decision making is important. Democracy is important at many different levels. A level must be commensurate to the importance of the decision. For example, if you're making decisions at a local level that are affecting people around the world, we know in studying humans and other organisms, the way we make decisions is often clearly very self-interested. That's why we make decisions. That's what a vote comes from. And you have to balance out people making decisions that affect them and people making decisions at a certain level that affects them, taking into account their short-term needs, which have impact on others. So it's important to have many layers of decision making. And my perspective is that decision making is best taken and involves most people when they have some grasp of the issues that have been decided. And of course, we can't all understand everything. So hence we vest those decision making powers in others. But if we have some grasp of the issues that people are deciding on and some interest in it from a young age, that will give us much more investment in those decisions and much more interest. Without it, who's going to, for example, yesterday key decisions were made in European Parliament regarding about 35% of the EU's budget, which is a huge amount. And those decisions were made regarding agriculture, food and land use across the whole of Europe for the next 7 years. There was hardly any interest in the media from that, and very few people that I spoke to were interested in it. Even when I spoke to them, they were more interested in a relatively minor decision about what to call veggie burgers, which came up. And that's just one example, but of how, unless it comes down to education and understanding in the first place. You can give people all the opportunities to vote and proportional representation, which I would agree with, and more opportunities to vote and more involvement, more grassroots decision-making power. But if you don't have an understanding and don't actually have a keenness to understand those subjects to some degree from a young age, then that's not going to be, you're not going to move on it.
I completely agree. I do think the educational aspect that you're talking about, that grasp, is so important. So just before we move on, I'd like to put a question just to anyone here. How can our education system sort of embrace the fact that education is essential for political involvement, and how can young people exploit things like social media to their own advantage to enrich democracy rather than compromise it? So that's just a question open to everyone before we move on to thinking about consumption as well as citizenship.
To pick up on that question, and also just to pick up on what's been said before, I think to me the elephant in the room is that the characteristics that are necessary to get elected in our current and probably most other forms of democratic government are incompatible with the characteristics we want of those people once they're in power. And that the big problem for young people is that you just have to basically, forgive me, Caroline, but for most politicians, it involves prostituting yourself to get votes. And that process doesn't change if you have PR. That process, you just change the rules a bit, but the basics haven't stayed. Democracy in its current form doesn't provide very much opportunity to assess whether the people we're electing are actually going to be capable of making good decisions. It primarily judges them on their ability to be good at getting elected.
That is a very interesting point. So how can our democracy be improved to ensure that what you're talking about doesn't happen?
And it's worse than that as well, because when you then come on to the next tier, such as, for example, getting stuff done, when you're in government, the people who come to you with solutions, whether they be the Sercos of this world and so on, trying to sell you a big track and trace system or whatever it is, all apply the same thing. Effectively, I mean, I've just spent the last few months getting through, thankfully successfully, it appears, getting some grant funding from the government for my startup. But what I've just learned is that I've now got to be good at grant applications. It's got nothing to do with my ability to do the work, to deliver the project. I've just developed a new skill in persuading them of what I want. Now, obviously, persuasion is important. We need to be able to carry people with us when we express ideas, but at the same time, as everybody from Goebbels to any number of figures from history have demonstrated, it's a very fine line between using those rhetorical and argumentative and convincing powers for good and simply using them for your self-benefit. And if we get in our modern, what I perceive is in our modern 24 hours news cycle, social media everywhere, yada, 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 we're now getting to the stage where a large class of politicians and a large class of people who want to be politically involved are spending 99% of their time broadcasting, and only really 1% of their time thinking about the issues that they're trying to govern on. So we're getting worse and worse and worse and worse. It's getting further and further away. If I look back, I know we're all slightly misty-eyed about our youth, although many people aren't. I mean, I hear a lot of people talking about Thatcher at the moment and going, oh, well, at least we're not as bad as her. If I look back to those eras, those people seem to spend most of the time governing. Mm. We might not agree with how they govern, but at least they seem to be spending most of the time governing.
So does that suggest a flaw in our current democratic system? Does that, or is thinking about a different, Michael, I'm coming to you. And does thinking about another political system other than like democracy or liberalism or conservatism, is that like thinking of a new color? Is that inherently impossible? Michael, I want to hear you.
Well, in many ways, it is worrying to see the decline in faith in democracy, although very understandable in all sorts of ways. And if you look at the number of democracies around the world, during the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, there was a huge growth in the number of democracies. But for the last 10 years, it's barely changed. And where I find something much more positive and inspiring is to see the emergence of participatory forms of democracy, like citizens' assemblies and so on. And then picking up on your previous question about how young people can get sort of more involved politically, another thing I find really inspiring is seeing the young groups getting together to take legal action against governments for their negligence, basically.
Has there been an example of that recently that has really caught your attention?
Well, there's a class action by some teenagers in the United States claiming that the government is destroying their future. It's a little while since I checked up on that. There's a group in the Netherlands called Urgenda. I'm not sure that's necessarily a young person's organization, but they successfully sued the government and forced them into really stepping up the level of ambition in their climate change policies.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. I think what we all got from that conversation was the fact that our current politics is not sufficient as it is now. And whether it's up to young people to sort of redesign what democracy means and what democracy looks like, is something that the education system will have to encourage. We can't just sit around and expect that politics will change itself. Like, politics is determined by individuals. So I think going forward, we really need to remember and act on the fact that we need to create these individuals. We need to empower individuals that will bring about the changes that we all want to see in politics. So now, thank you so much for your contributions, by the way. I really enjoyed listening to all of that. So now I want to start thinking about how we act as consumers as well as citizens. So I think what I'd like to start with is Vivian. I want to know, what contribution do arts and crafts bring, and how can young people use that to their advantage? Oh, Vivian, you're muted. Thank you, thanks.
Arts and crafts I define as things which are made by people using their hands from raw or natural materials, or from things that are past their best or have previously served another purpose. I did say that I was very old, and in the 50s I was brought up to learn these things like knitting, sewing, baking, and gardening, because everyone had to do them, because there was still factories had been producing things for the war and were taking time to change their ways. Materials, there was a shortage of them, and we were still having various, now the word's gone from me, rationing. So there was a huge shortage of housing, which the government did address. But meanwhile, there were food and clothing were essential. And those were the things that we needed to have. And so most everybody did something. They knitted, they sewed, they gardened, they baked. I mean, a cake from a shop was a total luxury. And so we all grew up knowing how to do these things. And when I was in school, at primary school, every Friday afternoon, we had a lovely teacher called Mrs. Anthony, who taught every single child in our class, boys and girls, to knit, to sew, to do practical things like how to sew a button on properly, how to darn, you know, all of these things which were great, and we all grew up knowing how to do them, and they were essential. By the time of the 60s, that no longer was essential. It was no longer a necessity. It was a personal choice, because clothes were cheaper, you know, you could actually go and eat out, which we'd never done. And so it's gone on and got worse and worse. And I've always carried out the crafts that I carry out. I am passionate about doing things with my hands. You can make things from scratch. You can take something that's past its best, you can do something with it, and you've got something new and unique. I'm heartbroken when I look at these cheap stores that sell badly made things and reduce our resources exponentially, when we've got masses and masses of things available that can be reused, remade, or made from scratch. And then, of course, there are the crafts that we do just for the sheer pleasure of it. I do something called corn dollies, which you may or may not know. They have no practical use anymore, but they're beautiful, and they give me and the people I teach to do them, along with all other crafts that I teach, a whole huge range of benefits. You have to start early. because a child that learns to play an instrument, a second language, or to sing a particular song will remember that 50 years later. They might have got a bit rusty, but they still remember it. And if you teach them things when they're young, they learn fine motor skills, hand-eye coordination, they get confidence, they learn how to make decisions, albeit small ones, but they've got that.
I think that's, yeah, I totally agree. I think that sense of like dexterity and doing things with your hand.
Yeah, but it's not just that, because, you know, you meet people, you go down all sorts of avenues while you're doing this. I mean, I've done everything from making costumes for films and theatre. I once had to knit a pair of Argyle socks for Matt Lucas. I've worked with the House of Fairy Tales. I've worked in Gavin's studio. I've had my own exhibition. You know, and I've met so many lovely people. But I think this teaching and teaching in a warm way, you know, arts and crafts have been let down big time by the education system. They're the poor relation, and they're the basis of virtually everything we do. I mean, you know, they increase your creativity, and creativity is the basis of everything. I don't use creativity just to knit or sew or make a corn dolly. I use it every day in my everyday life. And the more creativity I use, the more creative I am. I worked in a bank. I worked in a publishing company. I worked in a very high level in a charity. And I used my creativity on all sorts of things every single day.
There's something that follows. It's something that should follow throughout. It's part of being a human being, going beyond like the formal, the binary, all of those like really linear things. And what I found really interesting was you were talking about how from the 60s, sort of that element of doing things with your hands sort of degenerated. I think that has been made worse by technology, by the fact that if you go into like even reception classrooms now, you will see children using tablets rather than writing. And I think that practicing children, I definitely agree with you, Vivian, that we should definitely be like encouraging things like woodwork, crafts, sewing, painting in schools as well. Like I think they're as valuable as things like English and mathematics, because it's about that skill that can turn you into a craftsperson. So I think that when young people are physically given the tools to be creative rather than just being given like the abstract tools like of knowledge and understanding and critical thinking, I think physical tools like smoldering, woodwork, like sawing something, physically making something in your hands, I think that's the kind of thing that I want to see being revived in the future. So I definitely agree with you. I just want to ask you another question. You mentioned the cheap clothing and things like that. So what do you think about the impact of fast fashion, and is there a way we can reduce the severity of it in the future? Oh, can you unmute yourself, please, Vivian? Sorry. Yeah, thank you. Good.
I hate fast fashion with a passion. I do buy clothes. I also make them. But if I buy something that I know is going to last for a long time, and I can change it, adapt it if I want to, make it unique, where everything that comes from Primark or wherever is just the same, and badly sewn and will fall apart. I was listening to something which said that, I can't remember, it was a very high percentage of these very cheap clothes are worn once or twice and never worn again and go to landfill. You know, they go to landfill. It's outrageous. And I think by starting early and giving children this creative ability, then they will, like me and like Debs, like Deborah, who is part of a group that we meet together, we have a glass of wine, we make things, we discuss things, and it's a great sense of community. But I have personally I have absolutely no idea how you stop that, other than to show people that there is a different way, and that it's, you know, in the 50s we couldn't have new clothes, so we made things out of things that we'd outgrown. we would unpick a jumper, and you know when you unpick wool, it's all wrinkly. You tie it all right. As you unpick it, we used to wind it round a milk bottle, dip it in warm water, tie it with a string on the washing line and let it dry, unwind it, and there we have straight wool to knit another jumper. And if there wasn't enough for another jumper, there was another one that had been unpicked, so we did a bit of Fair Isle.
Thank you.
It wasn't, I must say, it wasn't an Enid Blyton childhood. You know, it was not an Enid Blyton childhood. It was very hard. We were very short of money. You know,
thank you for your honesty, Vivian. Unfortunately, I'm just going to have to stop you there. Michael, would you like to add anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the issue about fast fashion. I mean, obviously, reducing consumption is part of it, but what I find very frustrating is that as an architect, we're often able to propose solutions that don't get implemented because we're told the market is not ready for this yet. So for instance, we designed a zero waste, zero carbon textile factory. It would have paid for itself entirely in just 5 years. And we were told, well, the market's not ready for this. The economics aren't right. If our economics actually factored in more of the damage costs of fast fashion, then these kind of solutions would immediately look far more attractive, and they would happen. One of the things I find most frustrating is that we have all the solutions we need to address climate change and biodiversity loss very rapidly, but they're not happening because of problems in the system.
So you're alluding to the systemic issues in our political and economic structures. So how would you like to see those things changed in the future so that greener architecture does have a place in our society? I'm opening this up to Dominic as well, because I know this is chimes in with.
I have been loving listening to this. I just picked up on some things that I'm going to sort of put together. Deborah talked about a human ecosystem, and Storm talked about decision making, and Vivian talked about arts and crafts. And I think arts and crafts is itself a kind of human ecosystem. I also think decision making is a human ecosystem, and these things can allow themselves to be and flourish independently of what we know today as the main kind of political scene. I think, our project, is really to try and make those things flourish, despite or in the context of all the things, that happen, like the COVID crisis, like the Brexit, like all the sort of rather unfortunate political landscape, so that children can understand, how they can themselves bring about these ecosystems. So in the school projects that we've done, we've built an architecture around a different kind of pedagogy that is essentially one that is run and orchestrated, choreographed, if you like, by the school children themselves, so that they make decisions on a daily basis as to how and what they learn. Mostly how they learn, actually, because what you learn, you learn by doing it. How you learn it is like a selection, of the different spaces, the different groups, the group sizes, the time spent doing different things. And what's great about that is that the individual students, individual pupils will have needs, of their own, They will have ways in which they learn better. They'll begin to know those ways in which they'll learn better. They'll begin to be able to describe those needs through making what you might say are individual decisions, but which are inevitably collectively made by the group. And that is a human ecosystem that we, as architects, want to develop, in order to become an alternative means. I'm going to use the word procurement here. Procurement means the sort of gathering together and bringing about, and getting, of futures. So that as architects, we use a phrase called creative discipline. And what it is, I think, like Silas says, you identify the problem in hand, then you set about understanding what the eventual solution might be, and then you work out all the stages between the now and that sort of I'm not going to say idealized future, but that real future. So that is, you might say, a kind of project-based approach that I think most schools, should adopt, as a fundamental way of teaching, over and above, these silos, or I don't actually like the word silos, and I'll explain why in a minute, but over and above the demarcation of subject areas, over and above the demarcation of pupil and teacher, of adult and child, and I'm much more interested in the choices that people make and are able to make. And we as a team in our project are much more interested in how to make those choices actually mechanically work.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dominic. Before we carry on talking about architecture and the role of biomimicry and all of that, I'd just like to welcome Mark Stevens. Hello, welcome.
Thank you, Asma.
Thank you for joining
us. Nice to be here. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. I think people knew I was teaching at Yale.
Okay, thank you for joining us. So just to let you know, we'll get to I do have some provocations and questions lined up for you, but we were just in the middle of discussing the role of architecture and environment. So we'll get to you shortly, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So yeah, the question I wanted to put forward to the architects and the engineers was, what are the social and economic effects of greener architecture, and why is it so important that young people start to pay attention to the role of buildings and the environment? So yeah, that's the question. Michael, does anyone have anything to add?
Well, I'm an architect. I think the environment, or when we say the environment, I think we mean the physical world around us that we have made. I think to understand that we have made it and we continue to remake it, and we can remake it badly or well, is something that the young people need to understand as literally their responsibility, but also that it is theirs to do with as they can and as they want to. And I think too much of the built environment is held apart from the people that use it, and they have they don't feel they have a direct engagement with it. So our project is to orchestrate a way of developing and first of all giving voice to and then giving practical effect to that physical environment. And I think it's very like Vivian's project in a way, because the idea is that you can build it intellectually, and you can also build it physically. I'm sitting in a house that I built, or we built, me and others built, and to do that, we learnt how to build along the way. We learnt how to intellectually overcome the impediments along the way. And it is in itself a arts and crafts project, but it's also one that I think can be made universally available, just through choice.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much. Michael, I wonder if you have anything to
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. Churchill once said that we shape our buildings and afterwards they shape us. And I think that's an important point. And I'll give you two examples. So our House of Commons, part of the reason our politics is so dysfunctional is because that's an incredibly badly designed space. It encourages very binary oppositional democracy. And if you look at modern debating chambers like the European Union, they're much more conducive to diverse and inclusive participatory ways of discussing things.
I think
another
that's
example.
Interesting point. I've never noticed that before until you talk about like European parliaments are more likely to have like an in the round sort of thing. So that's really interesting.
If I could give you one more example, there's a hospital in Singapore designed with a principle called biophilia, which is based on the principle that humans are happier, healthier, more productive if they're in regular contact with nature. And it's been shown that hospitals designed like that can treat people 8% more quickly and with half the amount of pain relieving drugs. Now, that's the way we should design all our hospitals, because in the medium to long term, they would be far cheaper and far better for humanity.
that is such an interesting point, and I think that goes into the fact that it's not only about what we can do, what people can do in terms of architecture, but what architecture can do for us. So just adding on to that point, Michael, what do you think, like, how do you think young people, like, how do the buildings that are built affect us as well as how we impact the buildings that are made? What do you think that relationship looks like, and what do you think that relationship should look like in the future if we're thinking about things like sustainability? That was quite a lot in the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understand your question, Asma. Sorry.
Let me rephrase it. I think because we were talking about how we can design buildings to be more environmentally friendly, but what is the benefit of having environmentally friendly buildings on us? Like that relationship between the person and the building that they live or work in. What does that look like now, and how can that be improved? I hope that is a bit of a clearer question.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Asma. Well, I mean, one of the great things about green architecture is that it's not just better for the climate and biodiversity, but it's much better for people. It can be better for their health and well-being and their ability to concentrate and, you know, their ability to be human. And you know, that is the potential of green architecture, that we can really kind of rethink and repair our relationship with the rest of the living world. Because currently our economies are based on a very outdated story, which is that we are separate from nature and somehow beyond the realm and rules of biology and physics. And actually, the best hope of shaping a really positive future is to see ourselves as embedded within a web of life support systems and to design in accordance with that.
Thank you very much, Mark. Both Michael and Silas made a contribution in the chat. Mark and Silas, sorry about that. Mark, would you like to make a contribution, seeing as we haven't spoken to you yet? And then I will go on to Silas and I will ask him to elaborate on his point.
Thanks, Asma. I mean, I wanted to pick up a couple of things that I sort of was provoked to by Dominic and Michael. I mean, interesting that this confrontational idea of politics I thought was interesting in the sense that, I don't know whether you know, but the distance between the front benches is 2 sword lengths. And it's so that you couldn't actually whip your sword out and top the person on the other side. And that's not a joke, it's absolutely true. And that's probably not the best foundation for the architecture, but just saying. But I'm interested also in the way in which architecture and construction impacts on individual human rights more generally. And I take that from everything at one end of the scale, like slave labor, right the way through to the ongoing impact on the environment at the other end of the scale. And I'd like to offer a perspective which I think will perhaps be unusual. There was a lot of criticism about the developments in Qatar for the World Cup in 2022. And a lot of it was around labor and inappropriate forms of gang mastering and so on. But what was really interesting was that Qatar realized, after criticism from Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and others, that they had a problem. And what they did about it was really unprecedented in the region and quite unprecedented internationally, which was that all the major construction companies there who were building the stadia were Western. They were German, they were Italian, they were Spanish, American, but none of them had their business and human rights, their obligations to comply with human rights, turned on because they make more profit. And so what the Qataris did was they legislated that they put on obligations on reporting, on treating labor and looking at the environmental impact and so on and so forth. And they now have to report. That's now had, so they had these systems because they used them other places in the world. They just hadn't used them in Qatar. And now that legislation has led to a wider scheme of improvement in construction in Qatar. And I think, you know, it's really interesting to learn this because we're not insisting on it on domestic contracts. So if we build a new Parliament building in the UK, or we build a new hospital or school, we're not looking at those kinds of things as well. And I think we should be. And, you know, obviously environment is a key element to sustainability and human rights compliance. We have less problems with indentured labour here, although we've seen the problems in Leicester recently. And so it does have a place, and we should just be aware of it and push to have these systems engaged. The EU, just as we leave, is about to have an obligation to have non-financial reporting. So what they're going to have is every year, a board is going to have to get an independent assurance in just the same way as they do financially for an audit, that their supply chains and that their business is human rights compliant. And I say, hooray, let's see that and implement it and innovate it in the UK. I don't see Boris Johnson rushing to the fore of human rights. He's never seemed to me to be the sort of archetypal advocate for it, perhaps, but there is the opportunity there, and I think the youth in this country and us, as some of the grey hairs, have an obligation to promote this kind of change, because I think it has meaningful and sustained impact.
Thank you so much, Mark. I was just really interested in that point you were talking about the economic implications, the thing about profit stopping companies from really considering human rights. And I think that sort of ties into what Michael was saying earlier about how like environmentally friendly architecture is often rejected because it's seen as there isn't a market for it. So I'm wondering if economics and profit really is the biggest obstacle in thinking about not only environmentally friendly architecture, but architecture that respects human rights. So I want to hear everyone's thoughts on that. What do you guys think?
Well, I think there's a. Oh, sorry, Silas.
No, please, Mark, go on.
I mean, I think it's critical, but of course, the other problem you get with construction contracts, particularly, is they tend to go to the lowest bidder, and the lowest bidder is going to put up, you know, an IKEA-like shed or something colorably similar. But that's because you're not being forced either by law or social pressure to look at the long-term cost of that building. And as a consequence of that, I do think we need to have a look at whether there are other things that we can put in place to ensure that the long-term cost is amortized into it and the environmental impact. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. Silas, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, to amplify what Mark said, one of the problems is that it's not that the costs are unknown, it's just that we rather bizarrely draw a line around the bit where we're going to be interested in. And we just arbitrarily say the cost stops here, and then we throw the rest out. Now, part of this is because of how we do budgets. I used to work in academia a long time ago, and we always had this ridiculous situation where somebody would decide we've got this much for capital and this much for running costs and this much for consumables, and you somehow couldn't change it, and you weren't allowed to cross it over, and you weren't allowed to look at the total cost. And once a year we'd get a big email around the department saying you must buy toner cartridges because we've got all this money, because nobody was thinking about what these costs look like or how they should look or whether they were reflective of the reality. And also there are just comfortable or uncomfortable, depending on where you are, lies. So I've spent some time working with a fair trade fashion company. I ended up in all sorts of ways. And one of the great lies is the idea that you can't do sustainable, ethical fashion, and that you can't do it at a price point that people can afford. And it's nonsense. I'm sorry, it's just nonsense. But it's nonsense because there's a certain set of assumptions. So the assumption is that we must spend 70% of our revenue on advertising. Well, bizarrely, it rather turns out that if you've got a better product and a better ethical story and a better relationship with your customers, you don't need to spend 70% of your revenue on advertising. You can spend 30% or 20% because your customers will do it all for you because they're so passionate about the product. But if you don't think that one step further, you just sit there and go, no, we can't do it. So much as with Michael and his factory, I'm sure if you draw in a very narrow sense, we build this factory, we can't afford to make it sustainable, but hey, we're going to have to do loads of stuff down the line, like amelioration, like paying for waste removal, like paying for PR consultants to try and improve our image because we're so terrible at it, and so on. It's just nonsense. It's utter nonsense. But there's, you know, everybody's so engaged with this. And I guess in going to the housing issue, I mean, we have problems at the moment because we put up all these massive housing projects. We create sustainability reports that say, oh, I'm sorry, we can only have 20 affordable units in this.
Yeah.
But these viability reports are written by about 20 people, as far as I can see. They're the same 20 people who've worked for both sides, deciding whether viability reports should say one thing or another. They work for the government to assess them. They work for the developer to create them. There is no competition of ideas.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. Just
please.
To play devil's advocate here, what you were talking about, you know, the unnecessarily advertising costs and everything. I think there's striking similarities in all of these conversations about the role of just like profit and this sense. I'm just wondering, do you think that is a symptomatic of the capitalist society we live in? And do you guys think that it shows just how badly capitalism like infects any sort of like the role between the inverse relation between capitalism and sustainability? Like, do they not mix? Is there any relationship with it? And if so, what is it? I'm opening this up.
Capitalism.
Caroline, would you like to? And Caroline, Michael, Robin.
Well, just while this whole conversation's been going on, I've been reminded there's a piece of casework that I have going on in Islington where I discovered that 4,500 fire doors, front doors on people's homes were not fire resilient after Grenfell. Now the council procured glass reinforced plastic fire doors, replaced them. They replaced 2,700 of those non-compliant fire doors, and then they discovered that the glass reinforced plastic fire doors that they had procured were actually not compliant. And they are still in the process of trying to correct all of this, having wasted huge amounts of money, but even more importantly, having created glass reinforced plastic waste that then has to be dealt with. And I think there is a real problem with the amount of money that councils have for the repair and maintenance of social housing, and the awful kind of short-termist decisions that are. We also have a problem with many homes in the public sector suffering from terrible mold and condensation, some of which is down to some botched attempts at insulation, but without installing the correct ventilation that enables people to live in those homes. And particularly when you have overcrowding, the need for ventilation increases because overcrowded homes, there are more people literally breathing, boiling water for pasta, drying their clothes, having a shower, hanging up a damp towel to dry after they've had a shower, living in their homes.
And I think that shows the friction between like respect for human rights and sustainable living and effective living and the need for profit, as you talk about, especially in councils. Robin put his hand up. Robin, I wonder if you have, thank you for your contribution, Caroline, by the way. Robin, I wonder if you have anything else to add about
what was I going to say? Yeah, I'm sure there are people here who know more about this than me, but I was just going to, from my understanding of it, I think one of the huge problems is entrenched interest. There are lots of situations where the green option is the cheaper option, particularly when it comes to energy. But the more environmentally damaging industry, particularly when it comes to fossil fuels and oil, are very heavily entrenched in political establishments, and they lobby very heavily. So it's trying to uncouple those two. And I think the broader point for the economy is that we have to have a tax system that factors in the long-term effects of your business decision. So if you are a fossil fuel company, the amount that you pay in tax should reflect future climate chaos and mass greenhouse and global heating. So I think you have to have those models, and you have to have them in on a macro level and with politicians who are willing to make that argument, because it is a very powerful argument.
Yes.
When it's made.
So, when it's made.
Yeah. So that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Robin. Michael, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Asma. I'd like to pick up on your question about capitalism, because we are at a critical moment now. We're in a planetary emergency, and there are plenty of people who are saying that, well, all we need to do is make a few tweaks to capitalism and maybe make the case for sustainability a bit more effectively and so on. And I came to the conclusion a few years ago that that's absolutely wrong. We're just not going to get to where we need to do by making small tweaks. What we need to do is to fundamentally rethink some of the sort of stories that lie behind the way we act as a society. And I need to explain what I mean by that. Humans are story-based creatures, and it's easy to see some of the old stories which are no longer valid, like, you know, men are better than women, or the earth is flat. Those are obvious. What's more difficult is to see the stories that are still dominant, that are wrong. So for instance, some of the current stories that we operate by is that endless growth is possible, humans are selfish, we're separate from nature. And the only way to replace an old story is with a new, more persuasive story. And I think now is a perfect opportunity to reset our worldview, because actually humans are not selfish. We're amongst species on Earth, we're uniquely altruistic. It's not endless growth we want, but we want a state of dynamic equilibrium with cyclical flows of resources. And it's more and more obvious now that our future well-being is inseparable from the well-being of the planetary systems. So small tweaks to capitalism aren't going to cut it. We need a fundamental rethink of what is driving our system.
And yeah, that's what I definitely agree with that. But then again, for me, in my opinion, thinking about a new economic and political system other than like capitalism, communism, it's like thinking of a new color. Like I don't think, because this is our normal, I don't think we have the capacity to think of a completely new structure that do you think so? And if so, what does that look like? Opening that to all of you. Yeah. Storm, would you like to contribute?
Sure. I guess a lot of people would think, well, AI will come into the equation at some point soon, or already, or has come already, and will potentially, whether we like it or not, will potentially show us other pathways, both in terms of decision making, but also approaching the world. Of course, just like the scientific process, AI is dependent on the questions that are asked and the design at the base. But the design at the base and the questions that are asked obviously inform the outcome. I'll give you an example. For example, someone was studying the detrimental impact of some insects in sub-Saharan Africa, one of my colleagues, and they were looking at all the harm that could be done to human society and to crops. And then when another question was put, and the results they came out with were completely honest, were as comprehensive as could be, but they weren't asked the question, what benefits do these species play? What niches do they occupy in these habitats and these ecosystems? And when you ask that question, you come out with a very different result. So on the one hand, I guess I'm playing devil's advocate with myself here. On the one hand, AI and other forms of decision making that go beyond our human mind, and as you put it, that the limits of our limits, which are based on our cultural and social biases and our traditions and our very minds themselves, could go in directions we can't even conceive of. On the other hand, they are built on the blocks of our own thinking and our own biases. That's not really a conclusion, but
no, that's a very interesting point. And I'm wondering, Silas, because you do some work with AI, if I'm not mistaken, do you think artificial intelligence can help us think of a new economic political model that we really can't come up with ourselves? Do you think that?
So one of the biggest challenges in AI is to create systems that are explainable and are auditable. The short answer is yes, absolutely. There is no reason why one can't come up with all sorts of really interesting structures. The problem is that one, without a great deal of control and a great deal of understanding of what it is that you've set in train, there's a very good chance that we will be no better off. The problem is defining what winning looks like. What is winning? What is a win for you? What is a win for me? What is a win for humanity? In the wider sense of this discussion, is a win for humanity necessarily a win for the planet? But my father made a very good point to me a few months ago. He said, what you've got to remember is that for almost all of human civilization, nature was something that was trying to kill us. That all of our development has been our conquering of nature. And only in the last few hundred years, or even in the last 100 years, have we really secured a technological advantage in that battle. And the problem we have now is to stop doubling down on that advantage and wipe out the whole of nature, but learn that, right, we've got far enough, and now we have to backtrack a little bit and live in symbiosis with nature. If I set up an AI system and say, and give it the task of finding a better system, how are we going to couch that question? How are we going to define what winning? At what point do we get wiped out, or the frogs get wiped out, or the foxes get wiped out, or and that's the problem. It's not what can we do. We can do anything. We've got enough nuclear weapons to destroy we destroy the planet tomorrow.
Yeah.
This AI provides lots of opportunities if we use it in a productive way. If we use it in the way that we've used computers, if we use it in the way that we've used cars and steam engines and everything else, which is to amplify human characteristics, if we do that and if we provide a framework to control it, then we'll be great. But if we simply say, hey, it's the new savior, and let's just let it solve all the problems, well, that's pretty easy to predict where that's going to go. And it isn't good.
I think that is a very good point to make. Mark, do you have any final comments on that? I think we really had a really in-depth conversation about that. I'm just going to go to Mark and then Michael just to round off this conversation before we ask if any of the audience members have any questions. So yeah, Mark, would you like to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Silas makes an incredibly powerful point about AI. Clearly, it is an improvement in the development, but I think we need to be educated about it. So those that are doing the programming build in unconsciously their own biases, and therefore we've got to build in the biases that we have. We've got to build in the feeling about environmental need and all of those other things. We also need to think about how it impacts on the global south and all of those kinds of issues. And I don't say that we should step back or stop using it. All I'm saying is we've got to educate ourselves about the potential flaws and try and fix them in order that it works better as a utility for society.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's really interesting. That's a really good point to remember, because we can get carried away with technology doing all the work for us. But if you've seen Jurassic Park, we all know how that turns out. So yeah. Michael, I was really interested. You mentioned donut economics. Would you like to just talk about that? Elaborate a bit more on how that can sort of help us create maybe a new economic model that future generations can aspire to?
Yes, sure. I think that sometimes there is a difficulty in seeing solutions, and often discussions in the media are rather binary. And if you criticize capitalism, then people assume that you're some knitted hippie communist. And actually, there are plenty of other ways that we can do things. And Kate Raworth's book and idea, Donut Economics, is just one of the most persuasive new models for economics I've ever seen. Because it shows how we need to do two things. We need to lift people in poverty up to a base, at least a minimum sort of quality of life. So in some parts of the world, we do need to grow.
In this country as well.
Yes, but then in terms of our planetary limits, we have to learn to live as a global society within those planetary limits, because otherwise we are finished sooner or later. And so the principle of donut economics is based on finding a way to live within planetary limits so that everyone can enjoy a decent quality of life. And it's been extremely kind of widely received. And I mentioned in the chat to Mark, actually, that it's been very widely received across the political spectrum. So in the Netherlands, there was a right-wing politician who was so impressed with it that he bought a copy for every member of the Dutch Parliament. Wow. And somehow we do need to get better at talking in ways that are much more inclusive and unifying, because we've seen such divisions emerge over the last couple of years with idiots like Trump and Boris Johnson and Bolsonaro.
Thank you, Michael. I was just wondering. I had a point, and I think it left me. I lost my train of thought because I was listening to what you were saying. But I was going to ask a question about, you know, the donut economics model. Does that, with living within planetary means, does that allude to being more sustainable with our consumption and how we live? And if so, I'm opening this question up to everyone else. What does that sustainability look like? Does that mean less consumption, or does that mean consuming things in different ways? What do you, Silas, I'll start with you.
Can I put the one thing in which we haven't mentioned, which is that, how about less people? So when I was about 14, or no, maybe 16, I was at the Bog Standard Comprehensive School. I was invited to take part in a debating competition. We didn't have a debating team in our school. That's not what we did. So we had to go off to this thing, and we were asked to come up with a topic. So I came up with the topic of are people living too long, which seemed to me to be quite a big problem. I won't bore you with the rest of the story about how that panned out. But that's the question, that's the thing we haven't touched on, which is, it's all very well coming up with lots of wonderful solutions, but do we have a fundamental problem that we just need to depopulate the planet? I don't mean by going and wiping people out, but, you know, there's got to be a population policy. One part of this equation has to be, how many people should there be? How many people are sustainable? How many people can we sustain at different levels of technology, cost, ecological damage, and what do we want that to look like? And I don't think that conversation should be off the table.
That's a very interesting point. Caroline, do you have, I feel like you are going to oppose that point.
I am going to oppose that point. We have a resource use and an inequality problem. And if we were to distribute the resources we have in the world in a fairer and less unequal way, we wouldn't be beginning to talk about a population problem. And when you start talking about a population problem, you are, you know, who is it that we're going to get rid of? Or, you know, I mean, I find that a really, really worrying path to be stepping down. And I think, but what I do think we need to be thinking about is the terrifying levels of inequality, which is why the discussions around universal basic income, where everyone has enough to keep a roof over their head, food on the table, and to stay warm and clothed. And then people are able to, either if they have caring responsibilities, they can get on with those caring responsibilities, but they don't have to worry about their basic finances. And anyone who wants to earn more money than their basic income, because they're not involved in something that doesn't provide lots of money, will pay tax on that. But I think we have to think about reducing inequality.
I agree.
About controlling populations.
Yes, thank you. What Michael said something in the chat that reminds me. So the richest 1% consume more resources than the poorest 50%, and that reminds me of an article I read during lockdown that in one day Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, made enough money to end world hunger like 3 times. And I think that just shows that there is such a concentration of important resources in the hands of so few people. I do agree with what Caroline's saying, that yes, maybe, Silas, depopulation for some may be on the table. I think before we talk about that, we have to accept the fact that there are major economic inequalities. I saw Robin, you had your hand up. Do you have anything else to add?
What was I going to say? I was actually just typing it. Well, I just think that resonates with what we were saying earlier, that this can be this idea that technology is going to be some form of silver bullet, but that can detract from the fact that this is a political question about equality and how we distribute that. And it's a political choice. And we have, in many ways, we have the capacity that we need. It's what we do with it. And just to resonate, just to very, very quickly, it's all there in the data. There's that great book, which you probably all read, which is The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone. And that makes the argument that once we get past about, £20,000 a year, which people, or maybe £30,000, something like that, what people need to live off for their basic sustenance, what affects people's life quality is equality and the gap between the rich and small. And they're a bunch of statisticians, and that's all in the data. It affects things as far-fetched as child mortality rates to how safe people feel in their own home. So it's very boring book, because once you get past the introduction and the conclusion, those are the main points, but then it's just mountains and mountains of data. But that makes it very persuasive, and it takes it out of that ideological mudslinging match that we can get drawn into. And yeah. And it's very important as well now, I think, since the end of the Cold War, and we don't have that people don't have that very problematic other option for how we do a system, which was the Soviet Union. Things are more up in the air, and so it's great to have that in the data. Sorry, I've realized I've talked a lot, but thank you for the time.
No, that's fine. Thank you so much for your contribution. Michael, any last points before if anyone else has, any of the audience members have any questions? I don't think they can unmute themselves, but maybe if tech support manages to mute. Anyway, yes, Michael, go ahead.
There's a really interesting example, which is looking at what happened in Iran. Iran went through a very rapid demographic transition from having very high levels of growth from about 6 children per adult female down to close to just a replacement level. And that was nearly all achieved in about 15 years through improvements in the opportunities and freedoms for women and educational capabilities. And again, that's why donut economics is such an important model, because if we were to address that inequality and the lack of health and educational facilities, particularly for women and girls in developing countries, the population problem would very rapidly be solved. So that's I think population is less of an issue than inequality and consumption.
I agree. Thank you very much for your point. Storm, would you like to see you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the population issue. I can see what all the panelists have said. I agree with all of them. But there's also the issue is a reduction in population or changes in population sizes in different areas does have an impact on quality of life. It also has an impact indirectly on decision making because it impacts where people live. So the UK or Great Britain, England was one of the earliest densely populated large countries in recent civilizations, at least. And that had a huge impact in our politics, people's lifestyles, and on people's quality of lives. I'm not saying for better or worse, but it does have a huge impact. It impacts on where people are going to live, how we navigate our environments, how our agriculture and our transport systems work around us. So although there's not a silver bullet saying if we reduce population, that's not going to reduce the fact that a huge number of people necessarily reduce the fact that a huge number of people have used very little up, and actually we could reduce 1% or 2% of the population at the very top and maybe would be doing better sustainability wise. But that there's and universal basic income, I completely agree with, and that will obviously change the dynamics a lot. And I put a question, I put a comment in our chat about how that would impact, as has already come up in the past in the 50s, and again now the question is what are we here for?
Yeah.
It came about as religion diminished in some countries and as industrialization came, and even more so now when we have large rates of unemployment, particularly in Southern Europe, in parts of the US and parts of West Africa. And then governments repeatedly the mantra of like, we must get everyone into work. To some degree that is important because it gives people a sense of meaning, sense of contributing to society, sense of structure, physical exercise, and a focus which can mitigate a lot of mental health issues and give people good quality of life. On the other hand, often that work increasingly in a service economy is directed towards, well, is not directed towards immediately obvious things related to our needs as a society and as individuals. So in the past, it was quite simple you could argue to be a soldier. I'm sure people could put another side, but to be a soldier, a sailor, a carer, a parent, a baker, a blacksmith, a teacher, etc. These were very directly relatable to our everyday needs, the hierarchy of needs, both as a community, as in individuals, and in much smaller communities as well. So it may not be as stark as oh, let's deal with the population in terms of sustainability.
Yeah.
But we really have to think about that and work and the meaning of income and work and what we do every day. And people are asking that with social media as well, like what do people do? What is their life for?
So Thank you. That's a very interesting point. Thank you very much. Martin, just going on to the Q&A box, Martin had two questions actually. First, she asked, what does anyone think about permaculture to save this world? And her second question is capitalism not destroying this world? So would anyone like to tackle the first question? What does anyone think about permaculture to save this world? No takers? Oh, Deborah.
Oh, I think that there's something really fascinating about permaculture and another word which is agrarian thinking. I'm in touch with a network in America, which is young farmers in America who are describing themselves as agrarians, and that has some permaculture thinking, but has a kind of a wider set of kind of thoughts and kind of tendrils of history behind it, which is to do with supply chains and to do with kind of the ecosystemic relationship between humans and food. And I think it's all fascinating stuff. The permaculture thing, Martin, is a no-brainer, and it's kind of links into a whole load of thinking, which I think is going on the other talk on the same time as us, which is around also what rewilding and kind of ideas of how we can kind of encourage nature to do its stuff more effectively, from everywhere, from grasslands to forests to peat bogs and wetlands, which my daughter's a passionate advocate of the ecological importance of peat bogs and wetlands to our future. I haven't dared ask what happened in the Common Agricultural Policy yesterday, because they were voting for their 7-year plan, and they have up until now been subsidising farmers to drain peat bogs, and that is an environmental disaster on every level. It's the biggest. It's got a bigger. She's got the statistics, but a bigger kind of carbon uplift than the whole of the airline industry. And there's kind of this kind of mad statistics, which is just not understood. And so she was doing kind of awareness raising campaign, but I don't know how many of those politicians actually saw what she was doing, because if they had, they would have been transformed. But yeah, does that relate to permaculture? I think it does. Just promoting the other talk on the other channel, by the way. And they're all going to be on catch up after this.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And I think that is how we will end such a inspiring and interesting conversation. I'd like you guys all just to finish by, in 1 or 2 sentences, tell us what you will contribute to the Great Imagining Project. So if we just go around, start with Vivian, what will you contribute to the Great Imagining Project in 1 or 2 sentences? Because I think we just about made it for time. But we really appreciate all of your contributions. I think it's been such an engaging conversation and has renewed my sense of hope. So I really thank you for all of that. But yeah, Vivian, would you like to start?
Well, my first question to you is, why do you pick me first every time?
Oh, really? You're next to me on the screen. No
time to think. The Great Imagining, I think is an absolutely amazing thing. And in my own small way, advocating for crafts, one thing we haven't talked about with those is the massive good that doing crafts has on mental health and anxiety and depression, and knitting has scientifically proven to reduce blood pressure. So there we go, that's a little but no, my aim is, as always, with the House of Fairy Tales and with Deborah, who is a very dear friend of mine, I will do whatever needs doing, be it practical or whatever.
I want a page in one of the syllabuses all around the different shapes of all the corn dollies in all the different regions of the UK and beyond, because actually she knows all about it, and it's lost. It's kind of lost.
These are samples. That is a traditional one with a great deal of history. The spirit of the corn is supposed to live in there. Every county, more or less, has its own. If you live in Staffordshire, that's a Staffordshire knot. If you live in Cambridgeshire, where there's the Cambridgeshire Horseshoe.
They came with,
And I want to add to that, as well, like the with the whole thing with in the big first talk of the day, which was around identity and how we relate to each other and ourselves. Actually just trying to understand how our own cultural traditions work. So my mum, who was a teacher, she used to have a lesson on how everyone makes their tea. And that was such a great way of, if there was any kind of like division in the classroom, of bringing people together in a kind of curiosity space, not in a division space.
So next person, Michael, what would you like to contribute to the Great Imagining Project?
Okay, well, I've said in various different ways, I think now is the time for really bold thinking, and the planetary emergency requires us to, I think, completely rethink our role as humans on planet Earth. And I see that as both a massive challenge and a thrilling possibility. And the new long-term purpose I'd like to propose for humans is to learn how we can support the flourishing of all life for all time.
Yes, that is a very nice little concluding point. Dominic, what about you?
I would be very interested to contribute. What I think I've just invented is decision-making exercises. I think I would like to somehow institute those so that the people, hopefully young people, entering into those exercises can become a resource for my project, because my project is their project. So to build a project together by making sets of decisions that we can kind of orchestrate into proposals. I might also like to thank you, Asma, for your brilliant
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Chairing of this project. I think you've made it fantastic this day.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Mark, how about yourself?
I think I want to contribute intellectual capital. I mean, that sounds slightly braggadly, but actually I think everybody here is doing that. And I think I want to be a facilitator. I want to be able to lift voices that haven't and aren't being heard. And that's why I think the Great Imagining is so important, because we've had a decline of critical thinking. Our attention span is that of a social media message, and to actually get underneath and think about why we need systemic change and how to bring that about, for me, is probably the greatest legacy we can leave to society.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Thank you, Mark. How about you, Robin?
Thank you. I think it goes back to what I said at the beginning. I want to help create a green movement that is inclusive, and by inclusive, I mean, resonates with the guys I played football with when I was 12 years old, who post things on social media that I disagree with wholeheartedly, and I probably have a fight with down the pub. They need to be made to care, right across to really important issues like access, disability, ethnicity, and things like that as well. So as broad as possible, a movement that is viscerally affecting to them, because it should be viscerally affecting to everybody, and that's up to us to tell the story well, so that it has that resonance. And practically, on a practical level, what I'll be doing with Deborah, I'm yet to find out, but I suspect it will involve improvised storytelling with children.
I think it's actually called the design of, one of the people who are going to help design the curriculum.
Okay, great. Well, I'll be doing that then. I'll do whatever Deborah tells me to.
Like all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Robin. Storm, how about yourself?
What I hope to see, hope we can collaborate to challenge and think about decision-making structures, which are the heart of our economic and environmental and social directions. And what I hope to contribute is being a cynic and being hypercritical of people's ideas, because that's what I do in private.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Sorry, did I cut you off?
That's fine.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Well, I spent the whole of this morning in a London Green Party AGM, and sort of going through the day-to-day stuff of keeping a political party going and running. And I think what's been really inspiring about this afternoon has been kind of hearing from people from different disciplines, different backgrounds. I loved Vivian's corn dolly demonstration just now, and I'm only sorry I haven't got a show and tell to share myself. But I think
I'll drop one into you next time I'm in Islington.
But I think the really important thing is, well, it's the importance of listening and hearing. And also, Asma, I think the way you've chaired this has been absolutely wonderful. It's been
exactly much.
Yes.
It's my first time chairing.
Oh my God, you're a natural. I've been in so many, Zoom events that have been much less well chaired than this. So,
Thank you so much.
You've really enabled a very sort of fulfilling and interesting conversation. So thank you for that. And, like everyone else, I'll do whatever Deborah tells me.
Thank you. And last but definitely not least, Silas, what would you like to contribute?
Well, I hadn't realised participation was a gateway drug to Deborah's latest thing, but obviously there's more instruction to come. Look, my son we only have one child, my son is 14. The one thing I've tried to buy as a parent is this, that in the modern world, you can actually learn almost anything. You're not stuck in the choices you make in the way that maybe our grandparents and great-grandparents were.
Yeah.
So my number one job as a parent is to make sure that he leaves our care with his self-confidence intact. That's the one thing you can't learn and you can't teach easily, but it's the one thing that empowers you to make decisions. And one of the things we haven't really talked about today is how we maintain young people's confidence to have their ideas, to be allowed to hold them in the face of adversity, in the face of people saying, you're an idiot. And to then use that superpower, because it is a superpower. It's why so many of you do the things you do. It's why Deborah gets these things together. She just walks up to people and says, I'm going to do this and you're going to come with me. And isn't that great? And that's confidence. She may not feel confident, but she has enough of it. It's why Caroline is prepared to fight the good fight, as she said in comments. You don't go to the Green Party politics because you think you're immediately going to get to be Prime Minister, because that's not the way politics works right now. But it's about having the confidence to say, no, these are my beliefs, these are my aspirations. I believe in them, I'm going to communicate them, but also the confidence to listen. And so much of upbringing and so much of how we teach people isn't about encouraging them to hold their own ideas. It's about teaching them orthodoxy. And I'm sorry, but we're not going to change the world through orthodoxy.
I agree. And I think that thing about confidence and empowering young people is part of what the Great Imagining is about, is getting young people to open their minds, but beyond everything that they're taught at school, like beyond textbook thinking. So I think you've summed that up really well. So just
I taught undergraduates very briefly 25 years ago, and my undergraduates hated me because I wouldn't give them the answers.
That's good.
I insisted that they had to think and come up with the answers, and they utterly hated me for it. But I'm afraid my attitude hasn't changed. We have to empower people to use their minds, to use their own imagination, which they're all brought with, to be critical thinkers, but also to be listeners and engagers, and simply to say, this is what I believe in, this is what I think is important, and this is what I want to achieve, and will other people come with me?
Yes, exactly. So so thank you guys so much for your contributions. We really appreciate everything you've said and everything that you will be doing for us. It was so nice. Thank you for bearing with us for an hour and a half, because I'm sure a lot of you guys are very busy and have other things to do as well. But thank you so much for giving up your time. We really appreciate it. And hopefully this is the first of many inspiring and empowering conversations to come. So I thank you all. And Deborah, round of applause to everyone. Deborah, would you have any last comments?
And thank you, Asma.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. I do. I mean, obviously, thank you, Asma. Amazing kind of like future ahead of you. There is a kind of, it's not easy when this has been put together so quickly, but the last few hours has just given me a sort of sense, my instinct to do this was correct, and that that this kind of conversation space is the way to build anything in the world. And actually, you know, I'm on a mission to kind of create a kind of plug-in thing into the national curriculum, whatever. And, you know, how are we going to get that into every school requires huge consensus and huge agreement. And the only way of building that huge consensus and that huge agreement and then knocking on the door of the politicians is to actually just get people in the room and get them talking. And so I feel like today has achieved that, and that intergenerational cross-curricular content is the kind of nature of the beast. It's the nature of the challenges that are facing us right now. And the one thing I put in the chat earlier, which is we need the future in the room. Like, it was something to do with future generations, something to do with the law for protecting the future and all that. And actually having young people in the room at every decision making is hugely important. And the idea of putting schools at the center of transformation in all their communities is just feels so exciting to me. And young brains are just genius, and you know, give them a little bit of space, a little bit of confidence, and it's extraordinary what they can do. So yeah, I'm excited, and I'm excited to get some sleep as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We hopefully speak to everyone soon, and we'll do this again.
Speak to you all soon, and yeah, to the next one. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.